Ladies and gentlemen, it will come as no surprise that Prince Harry is clearly, deeply in the throes of a little something called regret. Now, some might be wondering, what's there to regret? Well, my friend, an easier question to ask would be, what's there not to, apart from his 2 children? Just take a look at his life, or rather, take a look at his face during his most recent BBC interview to get an idea of the life that he has led over these past 5.5 years. There's no other way to say it. The man has lost, apart from his children, everything. From the 24/7 paid armed security and access to intel that he basically had a public breakdown over, to royal residences and the prestige that comes with being a prominent member of the British royal family. And that's just the materialistic things which he and his wife clearly care about the most. I haven't even touched upon the personal relationships with both family and friends that he has possibly lost forever. I mean, people are moving out without leaving so much as a forwarding address with Harry, leaving him to knock on doors, literally in a London street, to find friends of his who moved out years ago and with whom he's clearly not in contact because he would have known had they still been in touch. Honestly, if he weren't such a rotten egg, I would actually feel bad for the guy because this is sad. But that's what his life has come to ever since Meghan and Megxit. Sadness, bitterness, misery, loneliness. It's getting so bad there in Montecito that despite alleging that someone, at least one person in the royal household, whether it's staff or family member, we don't know, wants him and or his family dead.
Through the disclosure process, I've discovered that some people want history to repeat itself, which is pretty dark.
He still wants back in. He still wants reconciliation, despite his life being on the line, according to him. Now, the worst part is, and what caught my eye and inspired this video, while all this is going on, Meghan persists with her, oh my God, look at us, we have such a perfect life. Sorry, my inner Valley girl just came out. It's disturbing. I had no idea she was even in there. But she's just prancing around with her manic grin, advertising to the world just how everything is all peachy.
It's felt amazing. Honestly, it's felt just so amazing and fun.
Disregard Harry's face and attitude in that interview. They're in their honeymoon phase, don't you know? And aside from that, they're in their concert era too. Whatever that means. By the way, just a quick aside, this is actually classic Meghan Markle behavior. It has nothing to do with Prince Harry. He's just a prop that she pulls out whenever she needs to prove to the world how amazing her life is outside of the royal family. I've seen pretty much every single Instagram post she had ever made before meeting Harry. And this is classic Meghan Markle main character syndrome material. I'm sure we all know someone, at least one person, who is just like her. I know I do. You know, the type that pulls out their phone and records and photographs everything pretending they're having a grand old time. When in reality, they're actually quite lonely and empty and bored a lot of the time, which is why they feel the need to convince the world otherwise, even though most of us aren't really privy to the truth. It's kind of like the Streisand effect, if you think about it. Remember when Meghan told Jamie Two Names that it was too soon to write a memoir?
I think people are often curious if I'm going to write a memoir, but I've got a lot more life to live before I'm there.
3 things. Number 1, that was clearly not a no, just a matter of time. 2, will she be consistent, one wonders? Will she continue along this path of the perfect life and Megxit was the best decision we'd ever made? Or will she veer into the victimhood path once again? Shackled to an embattled man. Someone who, in her mind, is mentally disturbed because she, purveyor of falsehoods and broken promises and tall tales of endless fame and fortune, couldn't possibly have had a hand in that man who happens to be her husband's bitterness and misery. Perish the thought. Or 3, will she go down the Wallis Simpson route? You all know I've been reading and making videos about Wallis Simpson's memoirs as someone who has read Andrew Loney's Traitor King and who has watched countless documentaries talking about Wallis's life from a third-party vantage point. One of my law professors told me I really should stop talking as I think or thinking out loud. Clearly, I haven't learned. But it's always interesting to see what someone has to say about their own lives from their own point of view. Now, I've recently finished her memoirs, and what's really interesting about Wallis's memoirs in particular, and something that I do not think we will see reflected in Meghan's memoirs, is the amount of corroboration that exists between her version and third-party unforgiving sources, such as Andrew Loney and his book Traitor King. We've talked about Edward and Wallis's love story at length, and you'll remember from my most recent video on the topic, which was released on Valentine's Day this year, that Wallis did not perpetuate the notion, the false notion, that she and Edward lived out the love story of the century. Now, whether her motives were purely for the sake of honesty or simply to elicit sympathy, I don't know. But what I do know is it corroborates, for the most part, the version of their lives that we got from Traitor King. To begin with, Wallis never pretended that Edward wasn't deeply affected by the rift with his family and the exile. Very early on, before their marriage, she quoted Edward as having said, "The drawbridges are going up behind me. I have taken you into a void."
We are on the freedom flight.
Wallis also shared something that I don't believe was mentioned in Traitor King at all. Edward was quite fixated on being kept up to date with all the goings-on within the royal family. For instance, he had tuned in to his brother's coronation, which took place on the 12th of May, and which, by the way, at least according to Wallis, they had both decided to postpone their wedding to June. They had both decided to postpone their wedding to June out of respect for the royal family. Contrast that with Meghan and Harry, who think nothing of setting up bombshell defamatory interviews while Prince Philip is on his deathbed, or announcing their first pregnancy at a cousin's wedding. But as I was saying, Edward had tuned into the coronation. As Wallis wrote, it was a silent group that gathered around the radio in the Chateau de Condé, which is where they got married, by the way, and also an interesting little factoid before we go on with this. Apparently, it was a location chosen by King George VI because it was more appropriate than the alternative. I find that interesting because it was owned by Charles Bedaux, who ended up being executed as a Nazi agent. So I do wonder whether Wallis was being dishonest here and trying to distance themselves from the man. But I digress. I just thought it was interesting. David's eyes were directed unblinkingly at the fireplace. He had heard the service twice before. First when his grandfather was crowned, then his father. Was he thinking of those other occasions? Was he thinking of himself in the abbey? He never said. The words of the service rolled over me like an engulfing wave. I fought to suppress every thought, but all the while, the mental image of what might have been and should have been kept forming, disintegrating, and reforming in my mind. I really doubt we would ever get this level of insight from Meghan Markle if she were to ever pen a memoir. Because in that one paragraph alone, the regret that just radiates out of it is something I just can't see Meghan Markle owning up to. Not in a million years. Because one thing that became very clear to me as I read Wallis's memoirs is that she's not afraid to say when she's wrong. Now, I'm not saying she's infallible. I'm not saying that the terrible allegations against them in terms of their involvement with the Nazis are forgivable. Far from it. But credit where credit is due. This isn't the first time that Wallis has admitted to regretting how things played out. Another thing that really struck me about this paragraph was this parallel that happened just now recently with Harry. I'm not saying it's exactly an identical scenario, but I just found it incredibly interesting when I came across this article from Radar, not the most reliable source admittedly, about how obsessed Prince Harry wants back into the royal family and is desperate for a reunion, but they have no space for drama. So basically the article talks about how Harry was glued to coverage of his family, watching and rewatching clips of their picture-perfect appearance during the 80th anniversary of Victory in Europe Day. Well-placed sources said Harry was fixated on consuming as much coverage as possible. One palace insider revealed, wait, this is weird because how does the palace insider know? I don't know. But he says he watches every second. Balcony appearances, viral clips, even Prince Louis' silly faces. He can't help himself. He may say he's moved on, but he's still obsessed with what he's left behind. The article goes on to say that insiders close to the Duke of Sussex said his feelings of isolation have deepened, even if he insists he's put the past behind him. I believe it. I believe it only because I see it with my own eyes every time I see Harry, especially in his latest interview. The man is brimming with regret. The only difference here between Edward and Harry is that one of them was being honest about his regret, and at least his wife was being honest about it too, and the others are still very much in denial, perpetuating the charade that only the two of them seem to be buying at this point, if Harry's even buying it. Now, it's important to note that unlike Meghan, Wallis always maintained a close relationship with members of her own family. She had a very close and loving relationship with her mother until she passed away, and she adored her aunt Bessie, who features heavily in this memoir and also in Wallis's letters, which we covered all the way back in 2022 about how she really didn't want to marry Edward. And so I suppose it makes sense how in that instance, she felt a sense of empathy towards Edward as she watched him effectively get iced out. Now, whether it's simply because he chose Wallis or whether it's because of the whole German Nazism ties, which the government was very well aware of, I don't know. But I think as far as Wallis is concerned, especially based on a letter she wrote to the Queen from the Bahamas towards the end of the war, we can safely say that in Wallis's mind, she believed it was all her fault. Madame, I hope you will forgive my intrusion upon your time as well as my boldness in addressing your majesty. My motive for the latter is a simple one. It has always been a source of sorrow and regret to me that I have been the cause of any separation that exists between mother and son. And I can't help feeling that there must be moments, perhaps, however fleeting they may be, when you wonder how David is. The Bishop of Nassau is leaving in a short time for England, having been appointed by the Archbishop of Canterbury, Dr. Lang, as secretary to the Society of the Propagation of the Gospel. I thought if you wish to hear news of David, you might send for him. He is a delightful man and has been of the greatest help to us here. He can tell you if all the things David gave up are replaced to him in another way, and the little details of his daily life, his job, etc., the story of his flight from France, leaving all his possessions behind. The horrors of war and endless separations of family have in my mind stressed the importance of family ties. I hope that by the end of the summer, we will be nearer that victory for which we are all working so hard and for which England has so bravely lighted the way. I beg to remain Your Majesty's most humble and obedient servant, Wallis Windsor. It's interesting that last part, though, as I was reading it, you already get a hint of Wallis's version of their involvement in the war. Namely, they had zero involvement other than the advancement of the Allies. Of course, that stands in stark contrast to what was shared with us in books such as The Traitor King, where Wallis and Edward were portrayed as Nazi sympathizers. Wallis actually has an entire chapter dedicated to their Germany visit in her memoirs, which I haven't included because it's beyond the scope of this topic. But I might just make a video on that in the future. But I digress. The Queen didn't really bite. All she did was mention Wallis very briefly in a future letter she wrote to her son, where she said, "I send a kind message to your wife." So I guess they arrived at some kind of mutual womanly understanding on that point at least. Cynical minds might say that Wallis was simply trying to curry favor with the royal family to secure that elusive HRH styling that she had been deprived of upon her marriage to Edward, which is something that, according to Wallis, actually caused the rift between Edward and his family. That was the breaking point for him. And this is where I start to go, all right, I'm not too sure you're being honest here. She says, the distinction did not seem particularly important to me. David had given up the most exalted of titles. It hardly seemed worthwhile to me to quibble over a distinction in a lesser one. But nothing in the aftermath of the abdication hurt David more than that gratuitous thrust. In his eyes, it was an ultimate slur upon his wife, and therefore upon himself. Yeah, I'm not too sure she didn't care, Mrs. Put my monogram on everything and refer to me as Her Royal Highness in my household. Wallis, in stark contrast, once again, to Meghan Markle, also shares her regret and her feelings about how sad it was that they had to effectively marry alone strangers in a strange land. She wrote, "I felt a shiver pass over me at the realization that my marriage to a man who had been sovereign of the world's greatest empire would take place, not in a setting long connected by birth or family association with either his life or mine, but rather in a land foreign to us both, in a turreted castle belonging to strangers. The drawbridges across which we had passed so many agonizing months ago had indeed, in David's bitter words, been drawn up against us." So that was her point of view. She clearly did not like the fact that they were not surrounded by friends and family. I believe she had her Aunt Bessie around at least, even if not during the wedding. She was definitely around for a lot of Wallis's life. She'd visit very frequently. But Edward in particular, and this was corroborated by Andrew Loney in Traitor King, was deeply disappointed. She wrote, "David longed to have his sister and his brothers, and most of all his mother, near him at his marriage. As is his habit, he kept his feelings to himself in that regard. But I knew, without his ever saying so, how deep was his disappointment. The unspoken order had gone out. Buckingham Palace will ignore our wedding. There would be no reconciliation, no gesture of recognition." And that's what makes me think that the whole involvement with the Nazis must have happened. I mean, we did cover the Windsor Files and discussed that aspect of history, which was hidden for quite a while, and the British government, headed by Winston Churchill, really tried to make sure that those papers never saw the light of day. But all that effort that went into hiding the documents, and the rift, the coldness displayed by the royal family towards Edward, makes one think that there must have been some truth to the allegations. Despite all this moroseness, Wallis did write that the actual wedding day itself was quite happy. "Here I shall say only that it was a supremely happy moment. All I had been through, the hurts I had suffered, were forgotten. However," she goes on, "only one thing marred our happiness. After the first burst of joy in rediscovering each other and being together, we found our minds turning back in interminable postmortems concerning the events leading up to the abdication. If only I had done this, if you had only done that, if you had only listened to me, if I had only known. This endless rehashing of the lost past became almost an obsession with us until one evening, David said despairingly, 'Darling, if we keep this up, we are never going to agree, so let's drop it for good.' Then and there we vowed we never would discuss the abdication again, and to this day, we never have." The third and final point, which Wallis was quite honest about, and I know this again from corroborating it with the Traitor King, is how Edward lived out the rest of his life trying to be useful, I suppose, because they both had this immense sense of meaninglessness, which is honestly what I think is going on with Meghan and Harry, and has been going on for at least the last couple of years, except they're still in the denial stage. Wallis writes, just as Andrew Loney did, about how Edward constantly reached out trying to get some kind of a formal post, some way to serve his country so all of his skills that went into training him to be king wouldn't be wasted. It's all he's ever known. Of course, there was also a sense of ego there, not wanting to take up a regular job or to work in commerce, as Wallis said, because it would be an insult to his background, effectively. But he was met always with a resounding no. In fact, his brother, the king, as we discussed last year in the Sussex-Windsor files, wanted him to stay as far away as humanly possible. Something which I am certain Prince William today can empathize with. Having said that, she does say eventually they did find happiness. She wrote about how Edward had apparently adjusted himself to his new way of life, which I believe, because we humans do have an incredible ability of adapting to anything. The way Wallis wrote it, though, made it sound like a journey. Like it wasn't all happiness and sunshine and rainbows right off the bat, the way Meghan Markle would want us to believe. She wrote, "Now of an afternoon, as I sit on the terrace, watching David as he moves from plant to plant, checking the growth of each, I often think of how well he has succeeded in making a new life for us both. Not quite the kind of life we had envisaged, but still one that is good." And mind you, this memoir was released in 1956, so it had been 20 years since the abdication. Interestingly, Wallis even echoes something that Harry said just now in the BBC interview about never really being a private person. She wrote, "Although it was some time before we could bring ourselves to face the fact in its entirety, ours was a most ambiguous and amorphous position. We could never really be private persons, however much we might wish it. While David had stepped down from the throne, he could never step out of the royal family. As the son, grandson, and great-grandson of former monarchs, and later the brother and now the uncle of a sovereign, he is immutably part of the royal institution, fixed there forever, like a fly in amber." And apparently a friend had once told them in Paris, "You and the Duke have none of the advantages of royalty and all of its disadvantages," namely the invasion of privacy and having your every move watched. It's apparently something Wallis did not enjoy, if you believe her version. She wrote, "These disabilities have presented special problems for me. Not being royal and in fact being rather pointedly excluded from the position traditionally accorded the wife of a royal duke, I have had to live in the knowledge that, notwithstanding my anomalous status, my every action, indeed even my most casual conversations, is inevitably judged against the fact of my being married to a former king. To fit my life into this context was a long exercise in self-discipline, for by temperament and habit, I had been content to live for the hour and the change and surprise the imminent moment might bring." Beyond this, she even goes as far as lamenting living passively. She says it's a woman trait, which I heartily disagree with, being a woman myself. The last word I would use to describe myself is passive, but she then kind of says it's on her and lamented the fact that she never grasped opportunities and simply just waited for things to happen. Now again, a cynical mind might interpret that as her distancing herself from the whole she schemed her way to the king's bed narrative, because here she's saying, it just happened. I had no hand in it. So that definitely occurred to me as a possible strategy on her part. Let me know what you think in the comments. The final regret she mentions is not having children, which I found quite sad, seeing as she obviously wanted them. Even in Traitor King, Andrew Loney wrote about how she really loved children. But then towards the end, the very end of the memoir, she pivots from this trail of regret that has been quite pervasive, actually. That's what I mean. I wonder if Meghan Markle is going to take this route. I doubt it, but only time will tell. But Wallis ends it on a high note. She quotes Lord Byron, "Man's love is of man's life a thing apart. 'Tis woman's whole existence. Any woman who has been loved as I have been loved, and who too has loved, has experienced life in its fullness. A woman's life can really be a succession of lives, each revolving around some emotionally compelling situation or challenge, and each marked off by some intense experience. And of these, I have had a woman's full share. All I can say is that everything taken together, I have finally found a great measure of contentment and happiness. So with that, we are concluding our coverage of Wallis Simpson's memoirs. It's been a few months in the making, actually. I found it incredibly insightful, and it's always important to hear both sides of the story, whenever possible. I will say the more I read from Wallis, the less I think she has much in common with Meghan at all. I don't believe Meghan will ever admit to any wrongdoing, any mistakes, any regret in her memoir if she ever writes one. Because unlike Wallis, she truly does not have that capability. She's been in the public eye now for almost a decade. And I mean the world stage as a famous, royal adjacent and then royal person. So she's had plenty of time to redeem herself, plenty of time to give us a hint of humility, of vulnerability. But all we get are crocodile tears and Cheshire cat grins. And I think that's all we can ever expect from Meghan Markle. As for Harry, honestly, the more I get to know about him based on what he's presenting to us, the more I see that he and Meghan truly are cut from the same cloth. And so I'm not holding my breath for any regret and confessions and mea culpas and honesty from him either. But you let me know what you think while I go have some lunch, because I'm hungry.